And so just to give a background on this session, so what we're starting to do starting this year, and I think we're going to make this an annual part of the SIGA, the PEP convenings, is there's a lot of interesting methodological approaches that are being used by different disciplines. And one of the key benefits of having an interdisciplinary crowd like this is so we can learn from each other on the tools that we're using. So today what we want to do is take a little bit of time to highlight ways of using data-driven approaches to generate psychometric measures. And we're going to start with just two really cool examples of papers that have done that, and I think using tools that might be broadly applicable for the kind of research that a lot of people in this community are interested in. So we're going to start with Bruce, Bruce, take it away.
Okay, great. Let me screen share here. Great. All right. Thanks so much to the organizers of this conference. It's great to be with you this morning. I've never presented a paper in 5 minutes before, so this is going to be something of a new personal record. I'll just say that. But I really want to thank my co-authors Sarah Baird and Jennifer Seeger at George Washington, Rafael Panlilio at IPA, and Stephanie Smith, who's a graduate student at the University of San Francisco.
And Bruce, actually, we have more time because I think Aaron's not going to need as much time, so you can actually take more than the really short time that we gave you.
Oh, great. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so our data comes from the Syrian civil war, where there have been over 6 million refugees, over half of whom are children. And so what we're trying to do here is use a quantitative analysis of children's drawings as this kind of non-invasive, very low-cost diagnostic tool to flag psychological trauma and in individual refugee children, and then also measure it potentially in larger populations to look at changes in mental health over time in the same refugee population, or maybe differences in mental health between refugee populations. So we have 3 data sets. The one is a data set that was collected by USF graduate students among Syrian refugees that were resettled in Jordan in 2016. And the second is a gauge data set that's collected in a very similar population of Syrian refugees that were resettled in Jordan in 2019. And then we have battlefield deaths by year and by province that we can trace back to these resettled refugees from the Syrian Revolution Martyrs database, which is considered to be one of the best measures of deaths that have occurred in the Civil War in different places in different years. So we use both conventional and machine learning econometric tools, and we use children's drawings as an indicator of mental health. And so this has been a really interesting literature in clinical psychology that really goes back to sort of the late 60s with Koppitz and a number of her early studies. And essentially what's happened in the last 50 years is you have these correlations of when you ask like a child to draw a drawing, you have these correlations with what they draw, what colors. They usually we offer them an array of maybe like 12 to maybe 20 different colors that they can choose to draw their drawing. And so certain things actually come out of these drawings that have been correlated over the decades with different aspects of mental health, mental illness, or mental health. So for example, in a free drawing, if you see a child drawing an aggressive action figure, like you'd see in this upper right drawing, that's been correlated with PTSD. Monster pictures, kind of same thing. In the refugee setting, we see political imagery, and over time that's been correlated with PTSD. Even as children choose what colors to draw in, so if you see like see a picture of a drawing that's done in a single color or done in a dark color, that's correlated with anxiety and depression. Choosing light colors or cheery colors has been correlated over the decades with low anxiety and happiness. So I'm just going to talk about, we test a number of things in this paper, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So one is using these drawing fixtures from these correlations in the historical clinical psych literature to create these indices of anxiety, depression, and PTSD, just created from these digitized drawings. What are the effects on children of exposure to violence from the Syrian civil war, and also from their families' assimilation as Syrian refugees into Jordanian society? And then second, and so in the first, we actually use the drawing features as the dependent variable. But then in the second, we actually use them as independent variables, and we're asking like what drawing features of these children can we use to actually predict exposure to violence as existed in the Syrian Martyrs database? And are these features consistent with the historical literature in clinical psych? Okay, so in terms of the effects of exposure to violence, so we estimate this, where YI is an index, standardized index of anxiety, depression, or PTSD, and X is a vector of refugee experiences that includes exposure to violence, assimilation status of the child's family, or could include both. And then Z is a vector of controls that generally describe the family and the child. So just really briefly, what we find in terms of exposure to violence is that it causes a big increase in PTSD, which is not surprising. What is maybe a little bit surprising is it can actually be captured in these drawings, right? In these colored drawings that these children create. So we see about a 13 percentage point, I'm sorry, 13.13 standard deviation increase in PTSD for exposure to violence. And then what we see is like reintegration. And essentially this is the family's choice, and we have a bunch of checks for endogeneity in this, but we see that as their family is chosen or chooses to leave the camps, and this is mostly from the Zatari refugee camp, and then assimilate into Jordanian society, we see PTSD falling and also depression falling in these children as measured by features in their drawings. So this is the USF data. And then we also use the GAGE data, which is on a similar population, but it's a completely different data set. And so, but we see very, very similar things. We see PTSD high with exposure to violence, and then anxiety and depression falling with reintegration. So a lot of consistency between the two data sets. Okay, so as Aska talk a little bit about Lasso. So this is the second main thing that we do in the paper, which is to use Lasso to actually say, okay, so here we have this very non-invasive, very inexpensive, very easy to carry out task, which is to hand a child a box of 24 colored pencils and say, draw anything you like, or draw a self-portrait. We had them draw both. But then from that, can we actually predict what their past exposure to violence was, right? Which would be, we would think would be correlated with different facets of mental illness. So we use Lasso. So Lasso is the least absolute shrinkage and selection operator. So it does two things. It shrinks coefficients, and then it also selects them, right? In some ways, it's pretty similar to ridge regression, and I'll explain the difference. But essentially what it's doing is trying to create a more parsimonious model. So it's minimizing just the sum of the squared residuals, just like in OLS, but then it adds this penalty function, which is weighted by lambda. And what it's doing, this penalty is the absolute, you're summing the absolute values of the coefficients on the independent variables. So what it's doing is it's doing this by changing lambda across this k-fold validation process, right? So you have your training data that's on maybe 9 out of the 10 folds, and then you have your testing data, which is the 10th fold, and then that flips as you iterate through the process. So through this, you're calculating the mean squared prediction error over lambda. So then Lasso is going to choose the lambda that minimize this mean squared prediction error. So Lasso is similar to ridge regression. Very similar. In fact, the only difference is that this penalty in ridge regression is some of the squared coefficients. And you can see how like ridge regression, just because of the nature of the constraint, by minimizing the sum of the squared coefficients, it shrinks, but it doesn't select. Okay, so these increasingly large ovals are the sizes of lambda. You can see here just by the nature of the absolute value, right? It creates sort of the diamond shaped constraint. Here it's not only shrinking, but it's also selecting, right? If this is what our estimated beta hat would be with lambda equal to 0. In other words, just OLS. So in a nutshell, that's what Lasso is doing. So we use Lasso to estimate this, where YI represents this exposure to violence from the Syrian Revolution Martyrs database, and then X is this vector of non-penalized demographic controls. Right. So there are good reasons to think why we might not want to penalize the controls, kind of put them in that lambda penalty function. But then D represents a vector of penalized drawing features that are obtained from the children of these Syrian refugee households. So, so what do we find by this? So we find one thing that we think is kind of exciting, which is that Lasso retains one particular feature in both data sets really strongly, which is when children draw aggressive action figures. So it increases the probability of their exposure to violence by about 16 percentage points in the USF data set, and by about 31 percentage points in the Gauge data set, respectively. In the Gauge data set, if a child draws a monster figure, that also loads really high, and Lasso retains it. It doesn't, it's not retained in the USF data set, but it increases the probability of exposure to violence by about 20 percentage points in the Gauge data set. Okay, so just summary of the main findings. So in terms of the impact of exposure to violence and reintegration, so the drawing-based indices, these indices that we just create from these essentially dummy variables that describe a drawing, increase PTSD about 0.13 of a standard deviation in the USF data set, about 0.11 of a standard deviation in the Gauge data set. And then we see pretty big reductions in PTSD and depression from reintegration. So we think that's the fact that we see it in both data sets gives us a fair amount of confidence that this is that reintegration is good for kids of refugee families, even with the difficulties that they face in mainstream society, perhaps in another country, that's better than that their mental health is better than it is in the camps. And we also find early and preliminary evidence that you can use a machine learning technique like Lasso to predict past exposure to violence, and then potentially current mental health, right? Because that's the channel that we would think it would move through. So with further validation, our hope is that you could use this as an early, really inexpensive, really non-invasive screening device for trauma among refugee children, both to flag individual children and kind of flag them for early attention by caseworkers, and then also to gauge the mental health of children over in say a large refugee camp, and then to monitor that over time by just having children do drawings at intermittent intervals, or even comparing the level of PTSD or different mental health disorders between camps with similar populations in them, or looking at the changes in a camp over time.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Maybe what we'll do is, because I don't want us to get too far behind time, since we have a bunch in this session. Maybe we'll take just one question. We have one in the chat, so maybe I'll privilege that one, unless there's a burning question from somebody else. We can take that instead. Okay, so the question from the chat from Berber Kramer is, do you still need human labeling efforts to classify the images in terms of drawing features visible in that image, or is that done through machine learning too?
Yeah, so on these, we did it through human efforts. It's our goal is to use machine learning to do that too. And I think machine learning is going to be really good at picking up colors and some other things, but it's going to take a little bit of work maybe to pick up some of the more subtle drawing features. I mean, there are things like missing mouth or hands held behind the back, or different things that I think machine learning is certainly capable of doing. But it would just certainly take some programming from people to do it. But if that were true, then you could process a lot of these drawings very, very quickly, maybe hundreds or thousands of drawings very quickly, to gauge the mental health across a camp, for example, a refugee camp, or any kind of disaster or war setting.
Great, thank you, Bruce. So now next we have Lilith.
Okay, yeah, I'm mute now. Let me just share. Okay, there we are. Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present this paper. Since I have just a couple of minutes, I'll start giving you an overview of the paper, and then I'll provide you more details about how we are using artificial intelligence to measure emotion recognition in the field. So let me start by giving you an overview of our project. What's the motivation of this one? Violence can substantially constrain human capital accumulation, particularly for adolescents and youth. Moreover, exposure to high violence in poor contexts can increase stress and emotional instability that may exacerbate inefficiency in individuals' economic decisions. In this sense, we are asking like, how can emotion regulation be improved for adolescents with the aim to address the effects of violence and their well-being? Considering that question, we studied that in the most violent non-war region in the world. Specifically, we tested the effectiveness of an after-school program in the most violent neighborhoods in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. In our settings, schools were randomly assigned to one of three treatment conditions. The first one were just extracurricular activities, and the second one was a curriculum that aims to strengthen participants' character, and the third one was a mindfulness-based and relaxation program. And the program was implemented by trained mentors during 8 months in 7 months, in 2019. We enrolled around 2,000 participants, adolescents between the ages of 12 and 16 years. And then we evaluate the impact of these interventions on several measures, including emotion regulation, which are proxied in our context by arousal and balance. So let's start thinking on what's emotion regulation in our setting, or has a general definition. It consists on processes that amplify, attenuate, or can help you to maintain an emotion. To measure emotion regulation, we use the Reactiva, which is like a platform or like a smartphone app that uses artificial intelligence powered computer vision to proxy emotional reactions. There are at least two advantages of using this platform. The first one is that it's a more objective way to measure emotion regulation than self-reported tests or instruments. Also, it's relatively easier to implement in the context of social program evaluations implemented in the field. And for instance, compared to using electroencephalograms, which is another tool that we use in another project in El Salvador. The brain or the algorithm and training for Reactiva was developed by Affectiva, which is a spin-off of the Affective Computing Group at the MIT Media Lab. So how does a Reactiva or Affectiva work? It works in 4 phases. The first one is just face detection. It uses like front cameras of smartphones or tablets. And that's why it's easier to get this tool into the field. Then after that, it extracts like facial features, and for that it uses computer vision algorithms that identify key landmarks of your face. For instance, like the corners of your eyebrows, the tip of your nose, the corners of your mouth, etc. Once it has captured these facial features, it classifies your expressions. And for that, it uses machine learning-based classifiers, which analyzes several pixels in a face region to classify these expressions. Particularly, Affectiva or Reactiva uses facial action coding system, the FACS, for this task. The highly accurate classifiers have been trained using Affectiva's massive emotion data repository, which is the largest repository of emotions with more than 6.5 million faces from 87 countries, more or less. And so once it has like classified the expressions, it maps those facial expressions to emotions. How it works? Well, the proposed system classifies or recognizes, like 6 facial expressions for instance, anger, fear, happiness, etc. The metrics are probabilities. For example, for the happiness emotion, an intense smile increases the likelihood that that emotion is happening, whereas a eyebrow rise decreases it. Now, that's how the system or the reactiva affectiva works. How then we apply that to collect data in schools? First of all, we installed reactiva in tablets. We visit schools and scheduled the data collection per groups of participants. Since we were interested in responsiveness or regulation of these emotions, we created a stimuli using short videos from the GAPED database. These videos worked as a positive or negative stimuli for the participants. Then once they were watching the videos, Reactiva extracted the participants' facial features before and during each of the videos. Using all these features and their changes, the app classified and mapped them to these measures of arousal, which can be defined as a state of being awoken or alertness, and balance, which is also a measure of, or can be interpreted as a measure of overreaction to positive or negative stimuli, which are the two measures of interest in our project. It's important to notice here that for these applications to work, we need an internet connection, which is something that we as researchers in developing countries it's not necessarily available in all the places, and we also need bright spaces so the cameras of the tabs will work. Then what are the findings of our paper or this project? We are finding that this intervention, like these psychology-based interventions, are reducing the arousal levels of participants relative to those assigned to the control group. Since the relationship between arousal and well-being can be represented as an inverted U-shaped function, and considering that adolescents are living in this highly stressful context, then a reduction in arousal for those treated can be interpreted as a reduction of their alertness level, which can translate into a better way to take more efficient decisions. So yeah, thank you for your attention and happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah, Kate?
Yeah, Kate.
Hi, thanks. That's really, really interesting. I wondered if you had done any work looking at the correlations of this with behavior.
Right.
I mean, I imagine there's psychological evidence on it, but yeah, it would be really interesting.
No, thank you. Thank you for your question. We have done that. We have done our previous project that we implemented only in El Salvador, in which we collected also arousal imbalance using electroencephalograms. And there is, in fact, a correlation. In the case of arousal, there is a negative correlation between at-school violence and arousal. In the case of violence, is the opposite. It's a positive, like the overreaction, as we are interpreting violence, is actually correlated with this misbehavior at school. When children or participants are more prone to overreact, then their behavior is worse at school. With this new project, we also collected misbehavior at school, and the correlations are more or less similar. They're actually stronger than the one that we collected previously in El Salvador as well.
Awesome. Great. So we're going to move on, and we'll have time in the group discussion at the end to come back and ask all the panelists questions. We're going to move on to Erin Fisher, who is a faculty member here at Berkeley. Erin, take it away.
There we go. Hi. So first of all, a sincere and deep apology for messing up this morning and not being here at 10 when I was supposed to be. I hope I didn't negatively impact too many people. I know I stressed Christina out tremendously, so I very much apologize for that. My email has been a disaster during this pandemic, and I just am very sorry. So speaking of which, I didn't prep slides, but I think that's just as well, because I'm such a fish out of water with this group. I think it'll be nice to kind of look at people's faces as I talk and see if I'm getting traction or should shift. So what I do is I'm a clinical psychologist, and there's a couple things that I think Mahesh reached out to me that thought it might be nice for me to chat about. So I work in this area that some people call precision medicine, personalized behavioral health, et cetera, et cetera. And it started with the main motivations in my lab and in my work around something we call idiographic science, which is the assumption that we can't necessarily understand individuals from groups. This is kind of the baseline assumption. And we published a paper in PNAS a couple of years ago where we really laid this out, I think, in a pretty effective way, just talking about that sometimes you might be able to divine information that's relevant to individuals from a group design. But you just shouldn't assume that that's going to be the case. And there's this idea of ergodicity and just some mathematical principles that state that the ideas like means and standard deviations and variances and covariances in data won't necessarily be the same for each individual as they are for a group of individuals. So that's kind of the main foundation that I started working from. And then out of that came the desire to kind of substantiate the quantitative work we were doing. Is it real? Is the question I kind of started asking myself. So we got into this idea of behavioral prediction, less as an entree into precision medicine and more to just kind of interrogate the quality of our own work. And so I see some folks that are here from departments of economics, for instance. So some of you may be already familiar with this idea of time series data, but we work with what you call time series data. So instead of a data set where you're looking at your data and the rows are different people or individuals or subjects or whatnot, each of our individuals has their own data set, and those rows are time points, and you try to get as many time points as you normally would people in your large designs, right? So if your analysis needed 100 observations or 200 or 1,000, well, we need to get that many time points per person. So we use a lot of stuff off the phone, of course, like many people these days. We do some psychophysiological stuff in labs. We find different ways to get lots and lots and lots of data per person. And just to kind of keep focusing on this prediction thing for a second, we'll take those data and we'll split them, right? Training and testing as we do in machine learning. And so we started with alcohol use, cigarette smoking, what else? Conflict in therapy clients who are having conflict with their intimate partners, things that were nice, kind of discrete, observable, not a lot of room to argue about the kind of construct validity itself, although people can always find ways to argue about that. But yeah, and so we've had some really great success. We have a paper, for instance, that is not online yet. We sent the proofs back 3 months ago, so waiting for it to pop up any day now. But we took college-age drinkers at Berkeley and we pinged them 8 times a day for a month. And asked them questions about how they were feeling and what they were doing, whether they'd had a drink, whether they want to have a drink, whether they're having a craving to have a drink, whether they think their peers are drinking currently, how many of their peers. There's about 25 items. We do a lot of this work, and we really try to calibrate how many times we're asking a day and how many items. For instance, I have a grad student who did a dissertation where she bothered people every half hour, 24 times a day, but only with 6 items, right? So we try to really balance kind of how many items total people are doing. And anyway, so we split half the time series, and person by person, we create these prediction models, and we had 84% accuracy, being able to predict whether someone was going to have a drink or not. And the other thing is they're offset by 2 hours. So the prediction model is not only predicting into blind holdout data, but it's predicting an observation that should be 2 hours in the future. So the idea that this sets up, and some of you may have heard this term, is what's called the just-in-time adaptive intervention. In my area, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work, with a lot of psychology and psychiatry research paradigms. There are these ceilings we've been hitting in psychology and psychiatry for decades now in terms of our efficacy for substance use disorders, depression, anxiety, you name it. We've kind of hit some ceilings, and we've been at those ceilings for a long time. One of the ideas that people have about how you can break through those ceilings is this idea of pushing intervention components to a phone right when someone needs it. That there's some sort of ongoing monitoring of the individual and their functioning, and you go, okay, this is the moment in time, when you need this. Now, as a licensed clinical psychologist who, before the pandemic hit, had a private practice, I can tell you, there's a lot of times when you're sitting with a patient, they're in distress, they know they're in distress, but when they come into the therapy office, this is not the moments they're struggling with. In fact, the very act of making the therapy room a warm, hospitable, welcoming, validating space is antithetical to what's normally upsetting them in the world. And they come in and they feel very comfortable and they feel very comforted. And it's hard to extract the distress and really work with it. And so the idea of the just-in-time intervention, of course, is they're out there in the world being subjected to the stressors and triggers and perturbations of that external world. There's something that you're monitoring in real time, ideally passive data. I loved that last presentation. You could be picking up, oh my gosh, I don't even have an answer for that. That's such a great question. Let me come back to that. Just looking at the chat. And I threw me off of my own train of thought, but anyway, so, yes, passive monitoring, the last presentation, fax coding would be so cool. Maybe you're kind of passively monitoring fax coding in the background. And when people's facial expressions are showing high degrees of intra-individual stress, you could push just in time to them, right? So passive data is absolutely the gold standard. I will say very quickly, not to be critical at all about that, the last presentation, but just this idea of subjective objective. I think it shifts, the ground underneath your feet shifts a little bit when you're shifting between within person and between person designs. And I think you can get a lot of traction out of within person designs when you are anchored to the person's own experience and their own reference points. And the idea of subjectivity and objectivity shifts a little bit there because people can be highly subjective and yet consistently, reliably, validly objective about their own experience. And when you're comparing in a data set or a research paradigm between subjects, those individual idiosyncrasies can be very disruptive. And I agree that something like a fax coding can be more objective between individuals. But since we do so much of this in my lab and in my work, this kind of very dense data collection of individuals, we do a lot of this stuff where models are built completely one person at a time, totally separate from any other person. And you can just get some incredibly impressive internal coherence from those types of data sets. I don't know about other fields, but in psychology, when you're talking about things like variance predicted, R squared, normally you're high-fiving when you can crack the 10% line. 20% is a real achievement. But when you're working within person models, you're regularly seeing 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the variance predicted because there's such a strong sense of internal coherence to the way people organize their own behavior. Anyway, a little all over the place, but of course, that's on me for getting into a winging it kind of zone for this. But the idea of the precision stuff is really interesting because we are building these models from these self-reports, and ostensibly you could use machine learning, and we'll use stuff. We don't do any deep learning or anything like that, but we use random forests and gradient boosting machines, support vector machines, lots of penalized regression models. We use those kinds of things. And we can, of course, ostensibly train these models to connect passive data signatures to these subjective reports. And then I think you'd really be cooking, because then you can have the phone kind of as a therapeutic assistant. It's just kind of passively, continuously monitoring people's experiences. and it's very straightforward to prepare materials or interventions. We've put some of these forward in press, as proposals, but I want to be clear, I haven't done any of these things. You could have the phone suggest, for instance, substance use folks to call your sponsor, right? For if you're in AA or NA. You could have people who are in intimate relationships call your partner, or the phone might even make the call for you. We've floated as an idea for suicidal participants. My grad student, John Reeves, has a beautiful paper that will be coming out in a clinical psych journal, clinical psychological science, where he built machine learning prediction algorithms for suicidal ideation and intent. And a wonderful paper actually just came out yesterday in JAMA Psychiatry from Shirley Wang. She's a grad student at Harvard who works with Matt Nock, where they were able to predict suicide attempts from within-person data. Really, really cool stuff and very close to the kind of stuff we do. Now, they didn't do any interventions there. So again, this is still conjecture that this can work and it can be effective. But these are the kinds of ideas that we're playing with, that you could be building a prediction model, maybe some mixture of passive and active data collection, substantiate that model with an out of sample test. Okay, this has some degree of accuracy, and then hopefully move to a fully passive model where you have ongoing monitoring of the individual, an understanding of what you're looking for, why, when, and what that might indicate they need, and then pushing interventions to them. Again, where those interventions can be quite simple. Hey, count to 10. You look like you're getting aggravated. Maybe take a break from what you're doing. Things can be as simple as that. And often, to be honest, as a clinical psychologist, sometimes the things I'm offering in therapy are that simple. I mean, I don't want to sell myself short. I can get into some more elegant interventions, but let me just open the chat real quick because that question got cut off.
So Erin, maybe I can jump in to help moderate. And
absolutely, thank you. I need corralling. I'm a person who needs corralling.
So that was super, super interesting. I think, so there's one question asking for a reference to your work, which maybe you can put into the chat a little bit later. And then before we get to sort of the policy question, maybe I can ask, so this is super compelling and interesting because you're basically able to intervene on something that is really hard for people, to intervene on and really, so it's impressive that you can get that kind of predictive power. You are collecting really intense data. And so I guess my question is, do you feel like then this is a great way to intervene on these really important things like suicide or alcoholism, where it's worth collecting the intense data because that's just a way to help people who might really need it? Or do you see a way to actually scale back the level of data collection to be able to apply this in like other contexts where that kind of data collection may not be possible at scale?
Absolutely. I think about these things a lot, and I have a couple different answers. The first answer that I have is that there has been a lot of excitement about moving to fully passive data prediction with behavioral stuff. And it hasn't quite panned out to the degree that people want it to. There's so much excitement. And what I would say is my first answer is that none of us like getting a blood draw, right? But if you're taking certain meds, you have to monitor your levels, and you might need to get your blood drawn twice a month, right? And you might need to do that for as long as you're on that medication. I was on a medication once where that's exactly what I had to do. We don't like a needle in the arm, most of us, right? But I thankfully just got my first COVID shot on Monday, and I've never been more excited to have a needle in my arm, right? And I think a lot of us feel that way. For those of us who have gotten it and those of us who want to get it, bring it on, put the needle in the arm. And so what I would say is I think that there's part of this where I think normalizing the expectation of this kind of thing for a greater good is totally possible, where you might think, oh my gosh, you're asking people things 4 times a day or 6 times a day, or that's so much. So that's the first answer, that I think that we can normalize things that seem not appealing. But if we can substantiate these things with passive signatures, that's obviously what we would want to do, because then the uptake and the rollout can be just much easier. Is really, so. And I think the work is trying to kind of have a parallel process where there's both advocacy and kind of marketing, if you will, for the idea of intensive data collection as a part of psychological and psychiatric care, right? Just kind of normalizing that being part of what we do. But also, of course, those of us on the research side trying to do as much as we can to minimize this. And one very kind of straightforward idea that we've been playing with is how to kind of use things like penalized regression, for instance, if people use that, to pare down your information to try to say, okay, well, we were surveying this larger scope of info, but we now understand that we only need this much of it, really, and that's going to do it. So you do have to keep giving us data, keep interacting with your phone, but you were answering 20 questions, now we only need 4, things like that. I think that there are methods that could get us certainly to that level.
Great, thank you. So I want to now open it up. So let's put the panel up, our three panelists, and I think let's open it up for general discussion. And so we, have had these 3 really cool examples of people using machine learning or just broadly data-driven approaches to both predict, construct psychometric outcome measures, which are just really hard to construct. And I think, as an economist, one of the things that's compelling about this is that often there is in economics a degree of skepticism around using self-reported measures, like somebody saying I feel happy or sad or so on, and that's just the field of economics is that way, that you kind of want to see a person actually engaging in a behavior. And I think both in all of these examples, there's, rather than asking somebody how they feel, you're kind of inferring it through a validated approach from what they draw or what their facial expression is. And I think that's super cool and exciting, and I think would be especially of interest, or is certainly of interest to economists who are working on these topics. One of the things I want to point to before we open up for questions is in the chat, there's also some other useful references for example, using text-based data to measure mental health. So this PNAS paper that Catherine put into the chat, I think is also of interest for this discussion. So let me stop there and just open up to general questions that people might have for the panelists. Okay, so maybe I'll lead with one question, which is I would actually just be interested. So one of the questions, Lilis, you got at the end of your talk was, does what you captured correlate with actual behavior? And I think it would be interesting to hear from you all on a little bit more on how you actually validate, like how do you actually go from, say I want to run a study and I go from thinking, okay, I want to collect data using these kinds of approaches. How do you actually go from saying, okay, well, I would love to measure affect, or I would love to measure depression or PTSD, and to actually figure out how you're going to take what people draw or their facial expressions or what they respond in a text message that you ask them in a survey on do they want to have a drink? How do you actually go from that to then actually formulating an outcome variable that's going to be on the left-hand side of an analysis?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for that question. Well, it actually started because we were working in countries in Central America in which gangs violence is actually the main source of violence in the country. And since we were not able to ask specific questions about the enrollment in the violent acts related to gangs, then we had to think on different ways to ask about violent behaviors, and then also about well-being, because for instance, if you are living in a neighborhood in which is controlled by a gang, then you are not that free to answer to different questions. So that's why we started looking at different ways to ask those questions. And that's how I partnered with Pablo Egaña, who has been developing these different tools, or he has been working with different people while he was doing his postdoc at MIT. And so we started thinking on, okay, if we are not going to be able to measure violence by itself, let's try to collect violent measures or violence measures using self-reports, but we can also collect additional information that can capture some features of well-being, such as arousal, which in some cases can be as a proxy of stress, or valence, which can also be or interpreted as like another way to regulate emotions, because it's also correlated with violence. If I can regulate my emotions, then it's more likely that I'm not going to be violent at school, for instance. So that's how we started like thinking on different ways. And then once we had these more objective measures, then we will be able to correlate them with not only like general violence, but particularly to violence in schools. And so that was the main idea. And yeah, so that's how this way to collect this type of data started in my projects. Particularly for the case of El Salvador, my first project in El Salvador, we were able to collect this misbehavior at school, and we also collect these arousal measures. And what's interesting that we're able to not only explore whether like these interventions are reducing or affecting any of these well-being measures or mental health measures or emotional regulation measures, but we are also able to see what are other characteristics that can affect those measures. In this project, we're also exploring whether being treated in a different composition of your peers, conditional on your initial level of violence, can also affect how do your the effects of intervention on these particular well-being outcomes are, or how they are affecting these outcomes. So it's like there's a lot of things that we can still do, not only like collecting these objective measures, but also trying to understand how they correlate with these self-reported measures, which is something that Aaron just gave us an idea of. Just try to understand when you are looking at and within individual, you can still use these subjective measures, which is something that we can explore with our current data.
Something that I would say, I would just, there's this mythology that I think that has developed over the, however many years, that self-report data is somehow weak data. And I am here to say that self-report data is often the best data you're going to get your hands on. I have worked with fMRI data, EEG data. I work with a tremendous amount of psychophysiological data. In fact, electrocardiogram and impedance cardiography signals. I've done some facial action coding stuff. And I am here to say that self-report data is consistently the best source of data. It is amazing data. And I would just simply reflect to all of us, if I ask you, do you feel stressed right now? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel angry? You're probably able to scan your experience and give me a fairly coherent answer. If I ask you whether you've done something or not, you're probably able to determine whether you have or have not done something. This is not to say that other sources of data aren't incredibly important. Of course they are. And of course, often we want to substantiate back and forth, right? We want to validate. But I just want to, I'm often this person to say this, I want to just take this opportunity to say self-report data are beautiful and wonderful and fantastic. The next thing that I will say is I will go in the other direction and just put an earthquake underneath everybody's feet and remind us all that our constructs are just that, they're constructs. So you mentioned PTSD. The current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, has 636,000 versions of PTSD. If you do the math out for how many different present, absent symptoms you can have to get PTSD, there are, like I said, just over 630,000, which is absurd, right? But we have to remember that PTSD doesn't exist. There's no such thing as PTSD. It's a construct that we create. So we have to understand when we say you want to put PTSD on the left side of your equation, well, what is it that you want to represent on the left side of your equation? Is it some sort of disruption to the person's daily functioning? Is it a level of distress that they're experiencing? Is it something specific about the nature of the PTSD, that they're always on guard, that they're suspicious of others, that they think that the world is going to provide negative outcomes, right? I mean, there's a lot of dynamics and characteristics to what PTSD as we think of it is, and what I think we want to have, when I think about precision medicine and precision psychology or psychiatry, I think about precision on both sides of the equation, really being thoughtful and precise about what it is we're trying to predict, and then also, of course, precise about making those predictions. And so I think the greater prediction you have on the left and the right side, the closer you get to actionable information. And so I would just kind of throw that out there again, is to just have existential panic about the nature of what we're actually measuring, whether we're measuring it, and how well we're doing that.
I had one thought on the question, and I'm going to defer in some ways to Aaron and other clinical psychologists in the audience. I think though with young children, sometimes self-reported data, at least this is the ideas that I've been exposed to, that self-reported data for young children, especially to strangers in kind of in an unfamiliar setting, often isn't as reliable as their behavior. One of the things that one of the reasons that we kind of like the drawings is that it's sort of something that they did, something that they chose. I think the controversial part about it is that they're used generally in clinical psychology along with interaction with the child. Like, they haven't been used very much before at all in big data or even kind of medium data, looking at like whole populations and the mental health of whole populations. And that's kind of the new area I think that we're trying to explore with this. But certainly I would love to hear more from the clinical psychologists on self-reported data for young children, and how that interfaces with something like watching behaviors or watching them draw, or the colors they choose to draw with.
I agree. I mean, you get young enough and you can't get self-reports. So I'd be crazy to argue with that. Yeah, and I think that even with adults, right, we see things with language, with differentiation, to be the ability to, emotion differentiation. There's a whole rich literature there, where some people can't really do anything other than valence and arousal, and some people can give you incredible granularity. So there's always limits to everything. I was just kind of advocating for self-report, generally speaking, but yeah.
Or even for adults in these particular settings in which we are working, where they learn to lie because you cannot like report how you're feeling, etc., because the context has taught you to just lie on how you are feeling, etc., which is in this case, for instance, gains control territories.
That's a great point. Yeah, I don't deal with anything like that. Yeah.
So let me know. What I'm going to do is pause this here. For those who want to take a break, please take a break. We're going to come back for our last session at 11:15 Pacific time. So just 5 minutes behind the schedule on the agenda. And then that's going to be our last session for the day. And then in the meantime, for those who are still interested, let's keep talking. I think the one thing I want to raise for the panel is I think this really interesting conversation between Pablo and Kate that's happening in the chat, and I think is relevant. So let's move that to the full thing. And so I think Frank, do you actually want to? I think your comment summarizes, I think, these two different views that exist in that conversation. Maybe I'll let you summarize those two views, and then we can take it from there.
Yes. Hi. This is very cool and very interesting, and so needed for us to sort of try to learn about these types of technologies. So I think broadly, one distinction that seems important is between prediction, which I think mostly is what Aaron was talking about, and trying to estimate treatment effect, which is what a lot of RCTs that many people here in the conference or in economics have been trying to do. And of course, more recently, these things have been more converging, or people doing sort of similar things also in economics in terms of prediction. So for prediction, in some ways, self-reports seem to be, as you say, super helpful, and we should collect them more and so on. For treatment effects, there is sort of the general suspicion, or sort of economists tend to be suspicious of self-reports, in particular if people are incentivized in certain ways. If I give you a bunch of cash and then ask you, are you happy? You should be at least somewhat concerned. But as Kate pointed out, we can sort of understand what these biases are potentially and try to mitigate them and try to measure them through some of the work by John DeQuitt and others by trying to bound experimenter demand kind of effects and the like. And so I think, I personally think, we as economists don't use self-reports enough, and we should be using them more, in part by sort of validating them or having other efforts to sort of understand potential biases that they might be affected by.
I agree completely. My I very strongly, in fact, my training in grad school, I thought I was going to be a clinical trialist. I went to work with some folks, Michelle Newman, Tom Borkovic, Louis Castonguay, who do these RCTs for generalized anxiety disorder. And I went there because they had these 4 archival RCT data sets, and that's what I thought I wanted to do. And then I went in a very different direction. But there's a lot of tools in psychiatry and psychology that are probably different from econ, because when you say treatment effect, you're often talking about different types of treatment effects. But we have observer ratings and interviewer ratings along with self-reports. There's been a lot of attempt to try to tie things to autonomic features, psychophysiological measures. It's not really panning out. We have a paper we just submitted yesterday where we're trying to push that forward a little bit with a methodology called unified SEM. If anybody knows about that, it originated in fMRI. Which allows us to model the autonomic nervous system as a system, which I think is an advance, instead of just taking pictures of the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system as cross sections. It's probably more than we want to get into here, but I just want to say that I agree with Frank completely, that you want to be highly suspicious of, if someone went into a depression treatment, not only might there be demand characteristics, but there might also be things like we call remoralization, where just the idea that they got treatment and somebody listened to them and they felt validated and seen, they'll start telling you they feel better because those are things their environment aren't giving them, right? And then the therapy is giving that, but is it actually attending to the symptoms? And you want to be very cautious and careful. And, so I could just keep going on and on. I'm a very rambly guy, but yeah, I just wanted to say I completely agree with Frank, and it takes a lot of thoughtfulness to attend to.
Do others have any follow-up comments on that? I think this is one of the big challenges in doing work in this space, that how do we get measures? And I think the state of the art often is, like, I agree with you, like the state of the art, and really it seems the most reliable thing is to ask somebody how they feel. But when we start doing interventions, I have the same, troubles. And then how do you measure that outcome if you just handed somebody $500? Other thoughts or views?
I guess I tend to think of data collection in terms of along 2 dimensions. One is sort of the causality versus prediction, right? And so, like, for example, like what we were doing, it's just pure prediction, has no causality in it at all. And then the other measure, which I have the most trouble with, especially with psychological data, is just sort of the accuracy of the data. Like, it's kind of like what Aaron, I think, was referring to earlier. What are you actually picking up when you measure this behavior or you have this self-report? And the fact that so many things in psychology are correlated, and if you leave something out on the right-hand side, you might be picking that up with the measure that you have that's very correlated with it, which we would think of, whether it's self-efficacy or locus of control, or, what are the distinctions in those things, and are they just kind of picking each other up? So that's kind of the other dimension that I sort of think of. But more, I think economists have a good, now much better feel for kind of the causality prediction dimension. But I think we're still on the data measurement dimension. I think we're still a long way, especially in this kind of behavioral economic psychology space.
So I have been really drawn to observable behavior in order to deal with this, right? So I have no background in substance use, but I started doing drinking and smoking research because it's like, you drank or you didn't, you smoked or you didn't. And then we had some cool success with that. And then we got into some, I guess this is a machine learning crowd, so I can just use jargon. We got into some unsupervised finite mixture model stuff where we used affect data, emotion data. So people who gave us 120, 150, 200 observations multiple times a day for a month about how they were feeling, which is highly subjective stuff, right? But we did person by person level mixture models. And we basically got these down into discrete states. And then you can use the posterior probabilities to code whether the state was present or absent in any given moment. And then we got into all this stuff of doing predictions of frequencies and presence, absence, and got all this traction that really helped, at least me, feel better at this construct kind of level about this touchier, feelier, messier stuff of emotions. Because we're like, okay, we're going to take the emotions, put them through the machine learning sausage grinder, and just turn them into states. And then now we've got ones and zeros, right? And now we can deal with whether it was there or not, or it happened a lot or happened less. And we're in that same space we were in with smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol. And so I'm very kind of currently in love with this idea of trying to get things down to discrete observables and really trying to anchor yourself to whether people are or aren't doing things, and doing things more or less. And to Frank's point, as a function of some intervention, are you generating higher or lower frequencies or likelihoods as a function of the intervention? And that feels a little more, dare I say, objective.
Kate, we have a question from you.
So, I mean, I guess two kind of things. So the one thing, criticism we get with the objective behavior measures is whether people are induced by treatment to report particular things that they think we want to hear on the objective behavior front. So I was interested if you knew, what the kind of state of the field is in your field on that. And then the other was, I guess, more a comment was, one of the things that really surprised us when we started measuring psychosocial characteristics was they just behave differently from the data that we're used to. Like correlations in assets or consumption over time are 0.6, 0.7 over a year, whereas self-efficacy is like 0.15 or 0.2. So everything we do, all of our kind of trials and measurement schedules and how often we follow up and all of those things is for economic outcomes. And then you just try to put psych outcomes in the same trial, but that doesn't work. The states you're talking about need to be measured quite frequently and at the time when people are making the relevant decisions. So it really is kind of quite shattering for the methodology, I think.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of talking. I want to make sure I leave space. I mean, I have so many answers there, but.
Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So everything I do involves a lot of dense collection, and so that obviously has to be acknowledged. But it buys you a lot, in terms of this idea of whether people are lying to you or not. There's a lot of ways to pick that up. For those in this who are watching right now who might be a little more quantitatively inclined, you're probably aware. You can look at distributions, you can look at frequencies, you can look at covariance. There's a lot of different tools you can use to see if the data are good or kind of fabricated. There's a cool kind of heat map thing that we do to see if people we're using one part of the scale arbitrarily, and we for instance ruled out an old measure an old app we were using where it started at 50 every time, and certain people had this heat map right on the 50, on the 0 to 100 kind of, et cetera. So there are ways you can pick that up. But when you collect data the way that we do, where you have this incredibly dense stuff, where you've got a lot of information for each person, so that helps with the lying piece. I wrote this. I mean, this is fresh in my head because I just wrote it and I just gave it to the editor. I was invited to write this perspective for this journal, World Psychiatry. Again, it was autonomic stuff, sympathetic nervous system. But what I wrote about, he was saying that we haven't gotten any traction with the sympathetic nervous system in depression, and people think it's a thing because of this connection between depression and heart disease, but we just can't find it. When you measure catecholamines and other measures, you just don't really see these group differences with depressed individuals. And so I wrote this piece where I said, I think we need to be totally redesigning the paradigm and thinking about these things as always contextualized and dynamic. The person in the moment, when the environment is stressing them, measuring these parameters, which you can do with ambulatory stuff. It's a little bit of an ordeal, but you can do it. And modeling a depressed individual's reaction to their environment as it's happening in the environment. And that would be the way to get signal. And who knows if I'm right, it's a perspective piece. You get to just say whatever you want. But that's my idea. And this is gets back, Kate, to your point about economic outcomes and psych variables, is we think they're connected. we feel like they should be. The way people think and feel has got to be related to how they act economically. But I think you have to capture it in the moment. I think it's about the time scale. What is the temporal scaling of the effects? You know, like for instance, the autonomic nervous system operates on an order of milliseconds, seconds, sometimes minutes. If you take snapshots of how that person is generally, I don't think you're capturing what the system does. Similarly, thoughts and feelings and how they affect purchasing behavior or planning or whatever, those are somewhat ephemeral often. They might be connected to longer term ideas like locus of control and agency, and am I someone who feels like I am or am not in control of my financial self or behavioral self. But the actual actions are usually tethered to pretty fast moving ephemeral processes. And so I think we have to capture those. I mean, these are just my thoughts.
Great. Well, thank you. I hate to stop such an interesting discussion, but this was awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce, Aaron, and Lilis for joining us.